Hey everybody, Trevor here, Triple T Archery, and this video is Gap Shooting 101, but spoiler alert, I'm also going to go over the difference between East Coast and West Coast gap. So for those of you who are currently gap shooters and are thinking of passing this video up, stick around toward the end because you might learn a little something. Here we go. So first of all, what is gap shooting? It is an aiming method for a single string bow. It is a way to use the tip of your arrow to aim at a target. So you don't need a sight or anything else. You can still aim and shoot very accurately, okay? So let's go down through the basics here. Basically, I've drawn a little archer here on the right, and you will see the trajectory of his arrow goes up and it comes back down. Now the reality, the arrow probably doesn't rise that much, but in theory that's what's happening because the arrow starts out underneath our eye and it has to come up into our field of vision, and then it loses speed and starts dropping trajectory until it hits the point of target. So how do you get started with gap shooting? Well, first you need to know what your point on is, okay? And what that means is that is the distance in which you can put your point right on the thing you want to hit, the point meaning the tip of your arrow, and you're going to hold that right on what you want to hit, and your arrow actually impacts there. So that is your point on distance. So get a rangefinder or pace it off or whatever you want to do. And for this example, my point on is currently 28 yards, so that's what I'm going to use. So with the gap method, we know that if we are closer to the target than 28 yards, if we hold our point below the intended point of impact like this, pretending that this is a bow, here's the shelf, here's the arrow sitting on the shelf. I know this is a really poor drawing, but I'm not a sketch artist, so I'm using the very tip of my arrow to aim. I know at 28 yards, I'm point on, meaning if I put my tip right on the point of impact, I'm going to hit it. So at 20, I have to hold it underneath, right? Because that's less than 28 yards. Now, how far under? Well, how do we start with gap? We find our point on, and we add or subtract 1 inch per yard from there. Now, this won't work for everybody perfectly, but you'll be surprised how many of you this is going to be very close to what your gaps actually are. So once you find your point on, you take away 1 inch for every yard. So if I'm point on at 28, it's 8 less inches to 20. So I hold 8 inches under my intended point of impact with my tip, and I shoot, and then the arrow should actually impact there. At 28 yards, I'm going to hold it right on what I want to hit, and it will hit there. And at 38 yards, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, that's 5 inches. I hold it 5 inches over the point of impact, and it will impact right there. So now let's see what that looks like a little more practically. So I'm going to actually zoom in. Sorry, I'm in my basement here. It is dark and I'm making this video late at night. So I know that from my point of impact to the bottom of this piece of paper is 7 inches from here to here. So if I were at 21 yards, I would need to hold right here 7 inches low, and when I shoot, it's going to impact right there. Now if I were at 28 yards, I would hold, and this is about what your arrow point's going to look like at full draw, I would hold my point here and I would impact at 28 yards. At 33, I need to be 5 inches high, so I'm going to be like this, and I'm going to shoot, and it's going to drop into my intended point of impact, right? So again, 20 yards, 8 inches low, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. See how that works? So it's all about your arrow point and whether you're holding it above or below the point of impact. If you are having to hold over here or over here to hit what you're aiming at, then you either have a tuning problem or you have some other problem with your form or your alignment or something like that. So that's just like on a rifle. Have you ever seen a rifle and then you sight it in, but then you have these windage marks, right? Well, windage would be out here, but you have elevation marks. So, you know, if you're sighted in at, say, 100 yards, this one might be 150, 200, 250, 3. It's the same system. You're essentially, rifle scopes are even set up for the gap method. And I've kind of drawn it out here just to kind of drill it in one more time. Here's my 28-yard point on. Where would I hold on the animal if the animal was at 29 yards? I'd hold, let's zoom in a little bit here. Yeah, if the animal was at 29 yards, I'd hold an inch high. If he was at 32, 4 inches high. If 24 yards, 4 inches low. You hold low if it's less than your point on distance, right? So I've drawn it on the deer here, little hash marks. So if the deer's at 28, I'm holding here, 27, 26, 25, 24, 32, all the way down here. You know, if I'm probably one of these is 8. So if this was 20 yards, I'd be 8 inches. My arrow point would literally be just like this. My arrow point would be right here, and I would shoot, and it would impact the deer there. Okay? So that is East Coast Gap. What East Coast Gap is thinking about the target, the distance you have to hold high or low at the target or at the animal. So the distance from here to here, if I literally walked up to a deer and measured from here to the bottom of his belly, that's approximately 8 inches. I'm not saying that's what it really is. On a 3D target, that's about right for a full size, but in real life, it's probably a little more like 10 inches. Or, you know, if we're aiming low for a heart shot, maybe it's like 6 inches, right, from where we actually want to hit to the belly of the deer. So you have to kind of figure that out, and the only way you get good at that is practice. And if you shoot 3D, you have to just literally go start measuring targets until you kind of get a point of reference. So before I go into the difference between East Coast and West Coast Gap, let's talk about how to change your point on. So let's say you go through this exercise and you try to find your point on, and your point on's like 40 yards, but you're like, hey, I'm a hunter. I'm like 25 yards is the most, you know, for me, let's just say 25 yards is the absolute furthest in the woods. I would take a shot at a deer. Open field, maybe 30, but like, you know, I prefer my deer like 18 or less, right? So for me to have a 40-yard point on makes no sense, because what would my gaps be if the deer was at 18 yards? I'd be aiming down here at the hoof, and that's not a very accurate way to take game. So most of you, if you have a problem with a reasonable point on, and by the way, you want your point on to be about 3/4 of the way to the max of your effective range. So you have to be honest with yourself. If your effective range is 25 yards, then it would be great if your point on was, like, say, 23 or 22 yards, right? If your effective range is 30 yards, then like me, 28-yard point on, excellent. You only have to hold 8 or 9 inches low if the deer is at 20 yards. That's really good. But if you find that your point on's way out there at 40, which will be, if you have a problem, it's usually that your point on is really far out there. You can do a few things. You can get a longer arrow. You can get a heavier arrow. You can get a arrow with a little more, maybe a little stiffer spine and a little higher point weight. All of those things will change your point on. You can anchor a little higher. If you're a split finger shooter, you can move all 3 fingers under to move the back end of the arrow up closer to your eye, because the closer the back end of the arrow, the knock of the arrow is to your eye, the lower it's going to shoot for a gap system. So therefore it will drop your point on from, say, 40 to a reasonable distance such as 28, right? So you have to play with that and figure out how to get your point on within your effective range. Most people don't like to aim over very much. So, you know, since I know I'm not going to be taking very many 30-yard shots at deer, and if I take a 25 or a 28, you know, I want to be close to where I really want to impact, because that's a far shot, so I want to make sure I don't have to be thinking about the gap. I just put the point on where I want to hit and I let it go, right? And then the closer shots, you know, I can comfortably hold under the belly and still execute a good accurate shot, right? So that's just some things that you'll need to play with to find your point on, and then start mapping out your gaps. Now, once you've mapped them out like this, you can go out in the yard and test them. You can get your rangefinder, stand at 24 yards, go down there, measure 4 inches low on an animal, and put your point right on that spot, 4 inches low of the 11 ring if you're shooting 3D targets or whatever, and or just a bullseye target even works, and just see if you hold 4 inches low, does this system hold up? Is this true? Did you impact high or low, or was this correct? And then you can make changes to this for your true gap. I can tell you this is really darn close to what my gap actually is, because I really am 28 yards point on, and I really am 8 inches low at 20, and somewhere up here I have to start adding more than an inch per yard, because my arrow gets so slow that around the 32, 33 mark, I actually need to hold about 6 inches high or 7 inches high. So, this is just a starting system, but most of you will find if you're shooting hunt and weight arrows that this is really accurate and very, very close to what your point on actually is. If you have a correct, an arrow length that's about right, and an arrow weight that's about right, and you have a reasonable anchor point, this is a system you'll be able to start with and make slight modifications to. Okay, so you know what East Coast Gap is. Let's talk about West Coast Gap. What is that? West Coast Gap is when you think about the distance at the arrow tip and not at the animal. So we know that theoretically there's, say, 6 inches. If I took a tape measure and I held it up to the deer, like if I literally just said, okay, Mr. Deer, hold still, and I said, let me measure you. This is a very tiny deer drawing. But if I was to go to a real deer and put the tape measure on him, maybe there would be 6-8 inches between where I really want to impact and his belly. Okay? And so that's East Coast Gap. But West Coast Gap says, I want to think about that distance at the tip of the arrow. So let me do something here. I'm going to try to hold this arrow and bring it into the sight picture. See if I can do that. Okay, so this is going to be a little weird, but now, on East Coast Gap, I might be holding that at 8 inches low, because down at the animal, 20 yards away, that might be 8 inches. But what if I thought about that distance at the arrow tip? So you see, I hold the tape measure here at the arrow tip, and what's the true distance? It's a 1/2 inch between the arrow tip and the point of impact. So West Coast Gap, out west, they have to shoot a lot further distances, so they have a lot bigger gaps. So if you have to hold let's say maybe you have to hold 3 feet over the animal. Let's say it's, I don't know, maybe an elk at 45 yards, and you're very proficient with traditional equipment. You might have to say, if you got a good heavy arrow, you might have to hold a foot over the elk's back, and maybe an elk is, 2 feet from the point of impact to the top of its back, and maybe another foot. So maybe you got 3 feet that you need to hold on an elk to hit it at 45 yards. Well, instead of thinking about that in where's 3 feet above that animal, you can think about it as, okay, I need to hold up here, but what is that at my arrow tip? So again, if I get my arrow tip way back here and I hold 3 feet over the point of impact and I measure down, well, this is a bad example. Let's hold 3 feet under and just do the same thing, because it'll be easier to see on the film, right? Let me get this out here where we can look at it. So if I'm holding here and I'm 3 feet under the animal, but I measure it, well, what is that? That's, let's use the 2 inch mark so we can see it. So maybe that's 1.25 inches, right? Okay, you see what my point is? Like, instead of thinking of it as 3 feet at the animal, it might be 1.25 inches at the tip of the arrow. And for some of you, that may be an easier thing for your brain to process. So no matter whether you choose the West Coast Gap style, where as you're thinking about the distances so let's do this again one more time. I just want to drill this in. See if I can get my camera to focus here. So here's my same target we looked at earlier. If I was holding my arrow tip, find my arrow tip here. If I was holding my arrow tip here, we said that was 7 inches. Okay. Now, but what is that at the arrow? What do you guys think? So, let me see. I don't have 3 hands, but maybe we can try to make this happen here today. We'll see what we can do. I'm going to hold the phone and the arrow. Maybe not. This may not happen, guys. Apologize. Oh, I almost got it. Okay. So, if we take the tape measure, now that's at 7 inches, so that's what it might really look like if you were holding the bow back. Now I'm going to bring the tape measure into the, I don't think you're going to be able to see the focus on it, but look at that. That's, I mean, you can kind of see the number 2 here. See if I can get the camera to focus on my thumb real quick. No, it's not going to do it. But anyway, you see the number 2 there. My arrow tip is pointing at it. So that would be like a ½ inch, essentially, right? At the arrow tip. It's either a ½ inch or 7 inches, however you want to think about it. At the tip of the arrow, that's West Coast. At the target, that's East Coast. All right? So that pretty much wraps it up. That is gap shooting and how you can do it. And how accurate can you be with gap shooting? Pretty crazy accurate. I mean, I have achieved, well, here. This is my practice target for 18 meters or 20 yards indoor. This was probably the last target I shot at for practice before I went to Lancaster in January, maybe? No, probably USA Archery Indoor in February or March, and I just left it up there. So as you can see, I'm eating the yellow out of that thing. I think the highest score I've achieved with longbow and wood arrows, I've shot in the 270s several times on a 300 round on this little face here in my basement. So can you be accurate with gap? Heck yeah, you can. I mean, you can be super accurate. You can hit quarters at 20 yards on good days. So keep that in mind. And if you're thinking about adopting or possibly just trying out an aiming method, maybe gap is for you. It's one of the most popular systems out there. Certainly there are others, but this is my favorite, and it's very versatile. And if you get your point on just right, you can shoot really accurately across your entire effective range, okay? Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks, everybody.